Hello and welcome. This is lesson 7 on the Olivet Discourse. The passages in the recording of this discourse in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that we just looked at spoke of Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. There'd be great tribulation upon the people of Israel. They should flee to the mountains. And this happened in 70 AD when the Roman general Titus came and destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. So immediately after that are these passages, and I will start off by reading them, starting with the one in Matthew. Then if anyone says to you, "Behold, here is the Christ," or "There he is," do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, "Behold, he is in the wilderness," do not go out, or "Behold, he is in the inner rooms," do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. And then Mark, which is shorter. And then if anyone says to you, "Behold, here is the Christ," or "Behold, he is there," do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show signs and wonders in order to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But take heed, behold, I have told you everything in advance. Then I want to read from Luke, and this is not from Luke 21, which is for sure the parallel passage of when Jesus is on the Mount of Olives, but I will explain a little bit later why we're looking at this too. It could very well be a parallel passage, but I'll talk about that later. And he said to his disciples, "The days will come when you will long to see one of the days of the Son of Man, and you will not see it. They will say to you, 'Look there, look here.' Do not go away and do not run after them. For just as the lightning, when it flashes out of one part of the sky, shines to the other part of the sky, so will the Son of Man be in his day. But first he must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation. And just as it happened in the days of Noah, so it will be also in the days of the Son of Man. They were eating, they were drinking, they were marrying, they were being given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. It was the same as happened in the days of Lot. They were eating, they were drinking, they were buying, they were selling, they were planting, they were building. But on the day that Lot went out from Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. It will be just the same on the day that the Son of Man is revealed. On that day, the one who is on the housetop and whose goods are in the house must not go down to take them out, and likewise the one who is in the field must not turn back. Remember Lot's wife. Whoever seeks to keep his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life will preserve it. I tell you, on that night there will be two in one bed, one will be taken and the other will be left. There will be two women grinding at the same place, one will be taken and the other will be left. Two men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other will be left. And answering they said to him, "Where, Lord?" And he said to them, "Where the body is, there also the vultures will be gathered." Now, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, this passage I just read from Luke is not from Luke 21, which is definitely a parallel passage with Matthew 24 and Mark 13. Excuse me. Luke 21 does not contain wording similar to the preceding in Matthew 24 and Mark 13. Let's actually look at that. There's the beginning, Luke 21, and Jesus foretells the destruction of the temple. That's the heading, not the actual scripture. And Jesus foretells destruction of Jerusalem. This was the passage we looked at last lesson, and talks about Jerusalem falling by the edge of the sword and being trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And right after this verse, if you're going through Matthew and Mark, is where this language about there'll be, don't go here and there, false prophets, Jesus will be coming like lightning, etc. That all fits in here, would fit in here in Luke, and it's not here. And this language of here coming up follows the passages we're looking at in Matthew and Luke. So this would have fit in right here, right where this title is, or the coming of the Son of Man, is where the parallel passage in Luke would have had the same language as Matthew and Mark, and it does not. So that's what I'm talking about. The passage that I read from Luke doesn't fit in Luke 21, basically. But Luke 17, 22 to 37 that I did just read does contain language similar to what I just read in Matthew and Mark. Matthew 24, 37 to 41 does, however, contain wording similar to that in Luke 17, some of it, but it's farther down in Matthew. So this is what it says. Matthew 24, verses 37 to 41. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be 2 men left in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. So that connects this passage from Luke 17 also back to the other passages we just read in Matthew and Mark. So just to summarize this next paragraph that I have here, when the gospel writers recorded things, they didn't necessarily record everything in chronological order. Also, Jesus repeated things. You know, a good teacher will repeat things, and they've got new students that come in that hadn't heard before, or just if you repeat things, then it makes the point, or it's remembered better. So we can't say this is the only time Jesus, when he was seated on the Mount of Olives, that he ever spoke of any of these things. So the point is, it's not clear. Did Jesus say these things on the Mount of Olives? Except the passage here in Matthew that we just looked at, where, well, yeah, that's the same language as in Luke 17. But the rest of it, he might have said it another time. He might have said it while he was on the Mount of Olives. Luke just didn't record it there. You know, it's hard to tell. So it's still all, it fits together. Has this language about becoming a Son of Man being like the days of Noah. That's in Matthew 24 and in Luke 17. And this point here, all 3 passages speak of not looking or going here or there. Don't follow after false Christs or prophets. Don't go here and there looking. In Matthew and Luke, both refer to lightning flashing across the sky and vultures being gathered to a body. So they're still very similar passages, and I believe the subject really is still the same, and this passage of Luke will help to understand the similar passages in Matthew and Mark. So the passages in both Matthew and Mark start with the phrase, "Then if anyone says to you." Based on the preceding verses, the word "then" refers to when the Roman army surrounded Jerusalem. So we're the time frame we're looking at of this, at least for Matthew and Mark, this false Christ and false prophets arising. Yeah, don't go out in the wilderness after them. They're not in inner rooms, don't believe it. And then, for as the lightning comes from the east and west, will be the coming of the Son of Man. Same thing, similar language in Mark, false Christ, false prophets, signs and wonders. Don't be led astray. So those are all things that in context would be around the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, either before or after. Here we go. This is where we're talking about it. So it's at that time. It's not in our current time, although, of course, there's still false Christs and false prophets. And even when you read the passage, it doesn't, it refers to that time frame of the destruction, but it doesn't say, oh, this is the only time this will happen, or it stops here, or anything like that. Let me scroll back again here to just notice that. It says, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Well, it doesn't say, it doesn't limit it to that time. I think it continues on, and had to have been, to be pertinent to this destruction of Jerusalem, had to happen for some period of time before the armies came, because if he's saying, don't go after them, don't follow them, but he also said, flee immediately, drop everything and run, there's not really time for these false Christs and false prophets to get their message out and have these false signs and wonders and such. So had to happen for some period of time before the destruction of Jerusalem. But he's specifically saying, when the army surround them, don't go after these false Christs and prophets. So they had to have their message out for a while. He's just saying, okay, when the time the army comes, don't believe them, don't listen to them, run, flee. I believe that's the idea here. So the point is, neither does it say that there won't be false Christs and false prophets after this point in time. There would continue to be. I don't think there's any question of that. But the main context is at the time in 70 AD when the Roman army surrounded Jerusalem. So going back to where we were before. Restating what I just said, I would believe that the false Christs and prophets were misleading them by saying the people should not flee but fight the Romans, and God would give them victory. That would a Christ, a Messiah, who would be the king of the people and defeat their enemies and reset up the kingdom of Israel to where they're not subject to Gentile domination anymore and have their own king. That fits the idea of a Messiah. So don't look here and there for them, but instead, Jesus' coming will be evident like lightning across the sky. So they won't have to go looking for Jesus. Oh, he's over out in this desert or this building, or let's go find him so we can join with him and we can defeat the Romans, or we'll be with him, he'll defeat the Romans and rescue us. And no, Jesus' coming will be like the lightning flashing across the sky. Now, when I say this is consistent with Luke 17:22-24, this idea that the false prophets were saying, hey, we'll defeat the Romans. Let's go back and look at Luke and see why I'm saying that. That is just the first few verses of this passage in Luke 17. And he said to the disciples, the days will come when you will long to see one of the days of the Son of Man, and you will not see it. They will say to you, look there, look here, do not go away and do not run after them. For just like the lightning, when it flashes out of one part of the sky, shines through the other part of the sky, so will the Son of Man be in his day. So he's saying there's a day coming. You'll want to see one of the days of the Son of Man, and you will not see it. It won't happen. So that fits in with the whole idea of the day they would want to see would be the Messiah coming and defeating Rome and rescuing them when they surround Jerusalem. You could argue with another meaning. I think it fits very clearly into that. And they will, verse 23, they will say to you, look there, look here, do not go away, and do not run after them. In other words, you're not going to see this day of the Son of Man. Don't go run after them thinking they're going to give it to you. And so I think that's referring to the false Christs and false prophets. And then he contrasts one of the days of the Son of Man when you will see it will be like this. You won't see it then, but this sentence, for just like the lightning when it flashes out of one part of the sky, shines to the other part of the sky, so will the Son of Man be in his day. So you don't have to run here and there looking for it. You'll see it. It'll be obvious. It'll be plain to everybody. So that's the main reason I'm bringing in Luke. Plus, if it's not a parallel passage, it's the closest to a parallel passage as it can be. And so it really fits the same things that are being spoken of at this point in Matthew and Mark. So Matthew and Mark wrote that the false Christs and prophets would show great signs. And, when I read in Josephus, he talks about these signs that everybody would see. And that there apparently were signs, but it sounds more like they weren't performed by the false Christs and prophets, according to how Josephus recorded it. But they use them to say, see, these are signs that we're going to defeat the Romans and follow us. Doesn't say they performed them, doesn't say they did not. So I'm discussing that a little bit here. I'm talking about the words used. The word translated show in Matthew 24:24, when it said that the false Christ and prophets would show signs, is from the Greek word didomai, which means to give. And it could have the idea of presenting signs, not necessarily performing them. And I saw that. I thought, oh, well, that's what's going on. They're just presenting signs. They're saying these things are happening. This means we're going to have victory. But the same word translated show in Mark 13:22. I'm using the New American Standard, so it's show in both places in the New American Standard at least. That's from the Greek word poieo, which means to do. To do, so it can really mean perform, that they actually did these signs. So they may have. I mean, Jesus said there'd be false Christs and false prophets that would perform signs, so I assume at least some were done by Jesus. But the historical record is not that clear that I found. I'm not a historian, but just what I've looked at and researched. So these signs, I actually quoted this in lesson 4, but again, this starting here. Thus there was a star resembling a sword which stood over the city, and a comet that continued a whole year. Thus also before the Jews' rebellion and before those commotions which preceded the war, when the people were coming great crowds to the feast of unleavened bread, on the 8th day of the month of Xanthicus, Nisan, and at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone round the altar in the holy house that it appeared to be bright day time, which lasted for half an hour. This light seemed to be a good sign to the unskillful, but was so interpreted by the sacred scribes as to portend those events that followed immediately upon it. Anyhow, it's talking about different signs, and if you actually look up this passage, it goes on and talks about more of them for a while. So there were, according to the historical event, signs happening at that point in time. But as I say here, Josephus isn't really saying that the signs were performed by false Christs or prophets. I don't have quotes of it, but he does talk about them doing, claiming that they're going to do signs and things like that, but not actually performing signs. Now, I believe there were signs performed because that all fits. And we look at these verses from the Bible, and there were false prophets, those practicing magic, the term is used. There were those in that time period whom the Bible records were actually performing magic. Well, you want to call it performing magic, whatever, but they did things that appeared supernatural, at least. That's recorded a couple times in the book of Acts, Acts 8, 9 to 11. Now there was a man named Simon who formerly was practicing magic in the city and astonishing the people of Samaria, claiming to be someone great, and they all from smallest to greatest were giving attention to him, saying, "This man is what is called the great power of God." And they were giving him attention because he had for a long time astonished them with his magic arts. Well, he was doing things significant enough that they were calling him the great power of God, and they were astonished. So not necessarily just card tricks. Don't know exactly what they were. And here's this other musician that speaks about in Acts 13. When they had gone through the whole island as far as Paphos, they found a magician, a Jewish false prophet whose name was Bar-Jesus. He was with the proconsul Sergius Paulus, a man of intelligence. This man summoned Barnabas and Saul and sought to hear the word of God. But Elymas, the magician, for so his name is translated, was opposing them, seeking to turn the proconsul away from the faith. Well, it doesn't talk about him doing very significant supernatural things, but he calls him a magician a couple times here. And also a false prophet in the, Jesus is talking about there would be false prophets. So there were in this time frame, this would be a while before 70 AD, but there were in this time frame some people about that were doing such things. So I don't think it's hard to come to the conclusion that, well, that still fits when Jesus is saying there would be false Christs and false prophets. And they would do great signs to deceive even the elect, possibly. If it were possible, is how he said it, not possibly. So if we go back to Luke 17, 22 to 37, in the language, some of it is similar to the language that talked about the destruction of Jerusalem, because he says things like, if you're on your roof, don't go back into your house. And, well, let's actually look at the language here again. And if you, on that day, the one who was on the housetop and whose goods in the house must not go down and take them out. Likewise, the one in the field must not turn back. Well, that sounds similar to what Jesus said, that when you need to flee Jerusalem, hey, don't go back into the house and get your stuff. And if you're in the field, don't go back. Just run right there. Leave everything. So is it talking about the destruction of Jerusalem again or not? That's the question here. And I don't believe it is, and I'll give you the reasons. Because of the language I just read, you could argue that it is, and it's it's not real clear. So we'll take it for that. Scrolling down to find where I was here. Okay, well, some of the reasons why is the verses we just read for Luke 17:24 show the contrast between you'll want to see one of the days of the Son of Man, but you will not see it. And rather that there would be this everybody visible, obvious seeing of this day of the Son of Man. Now, you could say, and the ones that are preterists would say, preterist. I should say that more clearly. Well, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple was, well, that was obvious in front of everybody. It's not across the sky, but, well, that fits that. Well, look at these other ideas in verse 30 from Luke 17. It talks about the day when the Son of Man would be revealed. It will be just the same on the day that the Son of Man is revealed. Now, is that Son of Man being revealed Jerusalem and the temple being destroyed? Or the temple being destroyed in particular? I think that fits more on the idea of the lightning flashing across the sky, in that it would be actually he himself being revealed, not him judging through the Roman army destroying the city in Jerusalem being revealed. The other thing, that the point I would just be about to read, is that in this passage it never says to flee. It only says one will be taken and another left, which is more the idea of the people not doing something, but something being done to them. So it's missing the idea of fleeing. It said they'll be taken or not. So I think a better fit is the speaking of the coming of the Son of Man. So that's my take on it. Now, let's see. Yeah, that was my third point. See, they're not told to flee, but the some will be taken. And the idea of, that's the rapture at the beginning of a 7-year tribulation, and then the Antichrist is revealed. The idea in the scripture, when they're taken, could be not taken to a good place, but taken to judgment. There's two ways to look at it, and I really didn't prepare to deal with that question, or what's the right interpretation on that. But it's not necessarily talking about a rapture at the beginning of a 7-year tribulation. This is my point. There's no in the passage that has that kind of language or that idea, and actually all the way through the Olivet Discourse, there's nothing that directly refers to that. That's all. If you believe that already and you're reading this passage, you'll see that maybe, but if you don't, where would you get that? So, the tribulation spoken of is at least starting in the days of the destruction of Jerusalem, not something yet far in the future and for a 7-year period. So then the question is, here in point 5, what then does it mean that the vultures will be gathered where the body is? That's from Matthew 24:28 and Luke 17:37. Okay. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. And at the end of this passage from Luke, where the body is, there also the vultures will be gathered. Now, that could be interpreted in a couple ways. One is, well, hey, we'll be gathered to Jesus. He's the body, and we're the vultures gathered to him. But in the Bible, the symbol of a vulture eating a body is one of judgment. When an army defeats another, and I'm reading from here, the bodies are left for the birds to eat. So it's normally not a good thing. Vultures eating a dead body. This terminology is used in Revelation 19:21. And the rest were killed with the sword which came from the mouth of him who sat on the horse, and all the birds were filled with their flesh. So when the armies were, whatever interpretation that you have of the armies in Revelation 19, when they're defeated, the birds come and eat their flesh after they're dead. So the symbolism of vultures eating a body, therefore, indicates the defeat of the armies fighting against God. Now, in the preterist view, that's, well, the Jewish people rebelled against God and the Christians fled, and the city of Jerusalem was killed and the birds ate their dead bodies. So if the preterist interpretation is right, that fits. But if there's this Jesus really coming to defeat the Gentiles, the whole idea that we started earlier with is, what is the end that is spoken of? And Jesus really, I believe, was saying, flee Jerusalem because the end is not yet. In other words, you're not going to defeat the Romans. And the end is then when the Messiah would come, defeat the kingdoms of this world, and there would be a war then, and there could also be this eating, the vultures eating a body being symbolism of victory for the one side and judgment on the side that lost. So I think that's the more appropriate interpretation of that. Vultures eating the dead body is one of judgment, based on what the proper interpretation is, which we're going through this whole series on the Olivet Discourse to see that. So far, I think I'm making a pretty good case that it's, Jesus he actually is going to come back to earth bodily, not the preterist view that this was speaking only of the judgment on Jerusalem, but this end that it's talking about, as I just said, is the time when Jesus will end the kingdoms of the Gentiles and set up the kingdom of Israel. So, the answer to this question, which one is it, is really more of how do you interpret this whole passage, this whole discourse from the Mount of Olives. So we'll get into that further next time, and thank you for listening. And again, I hope it's challenging, encouraging, instructive, and all those things. Thank you. Bye-bye.